Hey, 7th grade art. I wanted to explain to you the robot art project. There's so many details to it, and if I don't explain it, it could go really good or it could go really bad. So the main thing about this project, we want to make three-dimensional shapes and three-dimensional shading. So you've done a couple of practice worksheets by now on 3D shapes and 3D drawing. And you're like, why am I drawing cubes? This is the most boring thing ever. I hate art. Well, sorry that you hate art. But the difference between drawing a square, which is flat, right? Squares are flat, and a cube, like if you can draw a cube, that shows that you're growing as an artist. And if you're just drawing squares that are flat, then you are kind of like, no offense, but you're kind of like stuck and you're not growing. So the reason why we do the robot project is that if you draw a robot three-dimensionally, you can get some of those 3D shapes like cubes and spheres and cones. So you can get some of those shapes and the shading in. And I'm going to actually show you one bad example of an artwork, and I hate to pick on I don't even remember which student this was, but this is from like 7 years ago, but hate to pick on a kid, but this robot right here is actually, in some ways, it's not bad. I like how they outlined the robot with a pen so that the drawing stands out more. Sometimes outlining things helps it stand out more. The first thing that they did wrong was every single shape they drew flat. So if you look at like the chest or the body of the robot, it's just a big rectangle. If they wanted to make it three-dimensional, they should have drawn the sides and the top. That's probably really confusing, so I'm going to demonstrate it later. But they didn't draw the sides of the top. They didn't make it three-dimensional. All right. So the drawing itself isn't horrible. They just didn't fit the assignment because they didn't make it three-dimensional. One other huge tip that I would have for any 7th grader is, if you notice on this picture, they colored the robot really carefully, but then they kind of got lazy in the background. And I use this phrase all the time, and sadly you guys are distance learning, so you don't hear me say this all the time, but they made the background really hairy. That's my word for when kids get really scribbly. So instead of like coloring in the same direction and coloring like soft and gentle so that it looks smooth, you can see at the top of the space, the outer space there, with the black, they just kind of like were coloring in every direction, and it's really hairy. I say hairy because it looks more like hair than it does like smooth space. So that's a huge tip for you in any art that you do, not just the robot art project, is to take your time to color smoothly. Sharpening your colored pencils will help the pencils go more smoothly too. Okay, so keeping your pencil sharpened. I know it's so much work because you color for like 8 seconds and then you have to sharpen it again, and yeah, that's lame, but it really does help your art. I do want to show you a couple of good examples here. All right, so this one right here is obviously WALL-E. All right, so if you compare the body on WALL-E in this picture, you can see the front, but you can also see the top and the sides of the body. Whereas the last one that I showed you, I was complaining about how it was flat, right? Well, this one is not flat. You can see the different dimensions, and even in like the arm, you can see the sides and the sides and the corners of the arm. So there's that. This person spent a lot of time going very slowly. They did color pencil WALL-E. They actually used chalk on the background. So chalk is easy to make smooth. Colored pencil takes a little bit more time. But anyway, so I want you to see how this one had the three-dimensional shapes. It has some shading. You can see some highlights and shadows. The last one didn't have any shading. It was just flat color. And then the background, like they didn't make any details, it's kind of just like blobs and blue and some shadows, but the background is cool, right? So a lot of kids in 7th grade art, they just kind of throw any old background on there as boring, This person did try to make the background at least look cool. The last picture here has a really intense background. So this student made their robot, and the robot's actually just a small part of the picture. You can see that in the whole piece of paper, the robot doesn't take up much space, but they did draw the robot three-dimensionally, and they kind of made like the background their focus. So what's going on here is it's supposed to look like it's a book that's open. So it's like they drew a drawing, but the drawing is of a book. And you can kind of see on the left side half the page, and there's the monster, and he's all like, "You're dead to me." And then on the right page, which is like the main one that you can see, there's a robot running down a path, and there's a bird in a tree, and then there's like the green monster coming out of like a water hole or a swamp or whatever, and the monster's gonna, like, I don't know, eat the robot or something. So this one is really cool because, to me, the main thing I look for in art is creativity. There's nothing wrong with drawing WALL-E, but something like this. I haven't given you guys this lecture yet because, again, we're not meeting in person, but the Minnesota Art Standards, basically, if you make a drawing, like if you copy someone else's drawing, you are meeting about 20 or 30% of the Minnesota state standards. But anytime you make an original where it's like totally your idea, then you're bumped up to, you're meeting like 60 or 70% of the art standards. And just the way that I look at art, there's so many art teachers out there that look at art in so many different ways. But for me, I love creativity because creativity means that you're using your brain and your art skills at the same time. So the more creative you can be, the better. Hey, art students. I am making a video to show you how to draw cubes. All right. So if you didn't really get this from the worksheets that we've done, if you draw a square, that's a two-dimensional shape because it's flat, right? So three-dimensional means that there's more to it. A piece of paper is basically flat, right? If you look at a box from a certain angle, it might look the same shape as a piece of paper. But you turn the piece of paper, there's nothing to it really. You turn a box, there's another side. There's more sides, right? So square, that's a two-dimensional thing. And kids, it's like a tough process to go from drawing squares to cubes. I get that. That's difficult. So I'm going to try to show you an easy trick or a couple easy tricks to help you go from drawing squares to cubes. One of them is to draw another square of the same size, kind of offset. Does that make sense? Offset. It's not like perfectly behind it. All right. Now the challenge there is to draw them both about the same size. And another tip is anytime you're drawing, you want to draw lightly, because if you press too hard with the pencil, then it's hard to erase, because we're going to have to do some erasing. So here I can just trace the corners. And we're getting closer, right? It starts to look like a cube. Now I have to do some erasing. So I want to erase this line out. I want to erase this little line there. And then there. And now I have a box. All right. If you actually left these lines in, this would be like a glass box because you could see through it. Does that make sense? A glass box, you can see through it. All right, so that's one way, basically drawing two squares that are a little bit offset, and you trace the lines. The way that I like to teach kids, this is like my favorite way to teach them because it's a little more advanced and I think it works in more situations. So if you know what a parallel line is, parallel lines, I guess parallel lines, two lines that just, and in theory they'd go on forever and ever and they would never intersect. They'd never touch each other. So if you draw three sets of three parallel lines, you can actually draw a three-dimensional cube. I'm going to show you what I mean. So the first ones that I always start with this rule are the verticals. If I can draw straight here. It's hard to draw straight sitting down. All right, so I've got three verticals. They're mostly vertical, whatever. All right. Now I am going to define what the bottom of my cube is by kind of making a V shape. All right. So these three verticals are parallel. Now I need to make lines that are parallel to this one. So I'm going to make another line up here. All right, so those are approximately parallel, pretty close. Not quite, but close. Then I actually need to make another one over here. Something like that. So this line, and this line are parallel. Now I need to make lines that are parallel to this. So it's going to go something like this. And I kind of messed up here a little bit. So I'll have to adjust. But there's that one, and there's that one. All right? So now this line, and this line are parallel. All right? Does that make sense? So there's three verticals that are parallel. Then there's three parallel lines that are at this angle. There's 1, 2, 3. And then there's three parallel lines at this angle. 1, 2, 3. And again, I have to do some erasing. I have to do a little bit of correcting here because I misjudged where I'd have to put that one. So there we go. When I draw really sketchy. It's like little light and little lines. And I hate drawing with markers and pens because there's no sketchiness. You just go, poof. But I can erase this. So there we go. There we go. Don't need that anymore. Don't need that. And if you want your box to look like it's open, right? If it doesn't have a lid, then you could leave that line. But if you want it to look like a solid box, you take that line out. Slowly but surely, it starts to look more clean. Okay. So there's like the way that I prefer to show kids how to draw a box. 3 different sets of 3 parallel lines. It's a little more advanced, and it works a little bit better in the artwork that you're going to make. Last thing, and I can't really shade with this, but there's this thing called highlights. The bells still go off when you guys aren't here. It's really annoying. There's these things called highlights and shadows. So I have to pick which direction my light is coming from, because without light, there's no highlights and shadows, right? So I have to know that first. So usually light comes from the top, right? Because normally, like, the sun is usually high in the sky. Usually, I mean, obviously not always, but then it's just makes more sense to put your lights on the ceiling or maybe a lamp, but you probably don't put a lamp on the floor. So usually your light is coming from like even or above most of your objects that you'll draw. So there's my light, and if I was going to shade this like a professional artist, this part right here would be the farthest from the light, and so I would shade this in the darkest. All right. So that's really ugly because you can't color nicely with dry erase markers. And then this side here would be like a little bit of a shadow. Okay. I would say the top would be pretty bright because the top is getting a lot of light. Now the last thing to this is there's something called a cast shadow, because everything casts a shadow. So you would take the angle that your light is coming from, and the opposite of that would be where your shadow is. So if the light's coming from there, I feel like the shadow would kind of be going a little bit like this. And then you would just figure out, so this edge right there is giving off a shadow, and that's where this edge goes. So you end up having like a little bit of a shadow that's on the ground because the cube is blocking the light, right? The cube is blocking some of the light from hitting the ground, just like that's what shadows are. So there's, in person, we spend 3 days working on this stuff, and I just spent like 8 minutes. So hopefully that makes sense, and you have enough information to be a successful 3-dimensional cube drawer, and hopefully it helps you with your robot art.